It would be great if there was a way that people knew. There's a way that people could just figure this shit out, man. If they could just know which ones they could trust or buy.
But here's the thing. There's an inherent tension here, because historically, the way that people know is a thing is approved by a government, or it has some imprimatur. Someone has given it a stamp of approval, right? And to the extent that we believe in decentralization, how do you achieve the same thing? No, actually, but it's interesting because no one ever gave Bitcoin a stamp of approval, right? Bitcoin just emerged as the winner, more or less.
Yeah.
I wonder why that hasn't happened with a stablecoin. That's an interesting thing. We could talk about that. I think it's a scaling question.
I mean, it kind of is Tether, but there are questions.
Well, there's issues with Tether, right? It's centralized. And for that reason, first of all, it's capital inefficient. This is one of the big issues with these centralized, fully collateralized, quote unquote, fully collateralized stablecoins, right? That if there's more demand for Tether than supply, then market forces dictate, macroeconomics dictate that the price is going to go up, right? And the way that a centralized stablecoin issuer would respond to that is by issuing more coins, right? To keep the price close to $1 or whatever the target price is. But in order to do that, the company behind Tether has to go out and acquire more assets and find a bank that's willing to hold them and communicate this to their auditors, et cetera, et cetera. It's a whole process. And I think for this reason, it has scaled, right? It's something like 80 billion, 70, 80 billion last time I checked.
Yeah. I don't see how you can have a decentralized stablecoin. A stablecoin is pegged to a specific sovereign currency. And therefore, the only way to almost guarantee it is to hold full reserves of the amount you've issued. And therefore, that has to be held by a centralized authority and managed by. So I think you can
that's one strategy, but there are other strategies.
But I think they're algorithmic.
Yeah, and there are centralized. There's 2 or 3 levers here that you can pull on, right? So one is, what is it pegged to? 2 is it collateralized? What is it collateralized with? How much is it collateralized? Is it 100%? Is it 50%? Is it 0%? Right? There's a sliding scale there as well.
But I think the point of this is like we have the dollar, not the pound, right? We have sovereign currencies. A stable coin is just a version of that, which is easier to move around the world. So, for example, if people accept stable coins over Visa and MasterCard, you can pretty much wipe out the fees that you have to pay with MasterCard and Visa because it's just direct peer-to-peer transfer, right? I just see this as a temporary thing that we need until Bitcoin either becomes the standard currency, right, or we will always have fiat currencies. It's binary to me. It's one or the other.
I think Alex Gladstein spoke about this as well, along the lines that what's funny actually, because Bitcoiners love to shit on the US dollar for obvious reasons. And yet the vast majority of stablecoins are tied to the US dollar.
Are they shitting on the US dollar?
It's a bridge, right? Like if you foresee a future in which, on one hand, maybe hyper Bitcoinization does happen, or on the other hand, there's some other reserve asset, maybe it's gold, maybe it's SDRs, maybe it's some basket of things or something. Still, to the extent that most of our expenditure, like we're how do we put it? Our liabilities as individuals and as companies are still largely denominated in fiat. That's just the medium of exchange and the unit of account that in the world today. So we have no choice but to use these things for now. But maybe it's a bridge to something better.
But are they shitting on the dollar or are they shitting on the Fed?
But they're intrinsically bound together. You can't separate those two, right? Because the Fed controls the monetary policy of the dollar.
Yes and no. You could have go back to the era of free banking and not have the Fed. I think the point is I don't think the dollar is the issue. I think it's the monetary policy and the people who make the decisions around the dollar, which devalues, debases people's hard-earned money.
And it probably wasn't an issue when we had the gold standard.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, is interesting because speaking of collateralization, the US dollar is not backed. It's not collateralized by anything, obviously, today since the 70s, whenever Bretton Woods happened.
It's collateralized by the US Army, by the guns.
The full faith and credit of the US Treasury, I think is what it says. But the point is it didn't start that way. It started out as collateralized. And I think it's interesting. One of the approaches we've seen with a number of these stablecoins is to do the same thing. They want to start collateralized by Bitcoin or gold or dollars or something, and then kind of gradually reduce that over time and eventually reach. Do you know the Wile E. Coyote and the Looney Tunes? I don't know if you guys have this in the UK. This right? And he runs out over the edge of the cliff. And there's like 10 seconds before he realizes it, and then he falls.
Yeah.
Right. So it's kind of like that. Like you kind of want to, like, you're reducing your collateralization and you eventually reach zero. And the idea is, can you stay there out over the edge of the cliff and not fall? In other words, like, people not realize that the carpet has been ripped out from underneath you. Right.
Yeah. The rug pull.
The rug pull.
The rug pull.
The rug pull actually happened.
Well,
that hasn't been achieved yet, but.
I mean, I go back. I don't.
But it kind of has with Bitcoin, right? This goes like Bitcoin itself doesn't really have intrinsic value. Right, that the value of Bitcoin is that
nothing has intrinsic value.
Well, this is the true reality. That Bitcoin only has value insofar as you believe that the network itself, people will still be using it. You could still use Bitcoin to buy things in the future, right? And so something, I guess, right? We're agreeing. Something doesn't necessarily have to be collateralized to have value, right? Value is a story.
Yeah, it's collective value. It's cigarettes in jail. It's Bitcoin for people who believe and hold and own Bitcoin. It's gold for Peter Schiff. There's a lot of different things that have different value, and it's all subjective. And a market decides what the value is based on what people want to use. That's all it is. It's very simple.
I mean, it's funny because this concept of value is definitely not a thing I ever in my whole life ever thought about before kind of becoming a Bitcoiner and getting into this space. And all of a sudden you realize it's not simple at all.
No.
And you know, price, right? When you say something feels expensive, and again, at our age, we're now beginning to be those old fuddy-duddies who say, oh my God, you know, when I was a kid, a slice of pizza used to cost $1. Now, who knows, right, what it's going to cost when our kids grow up. But what does that mean for something to be overpriced? What does it actually mean in concrete terms?
I mean, I'd never thought about inflation,
right?
What inflation really is and how insidious it is until Bitcoin. I'd never thought about the value of things. I'd never thought about saving for my future.
Right.
I never thought about any of this
time
shit.
preference.
Yeah. I was just literally a moron bumbling through life, earning money and spending money and not thinking about it in the slightest, which is why I think there's there's this thing about Bitcoin where what people miss in parts of the education. It's not just about money. It's the wider things you learn about yourself and life that come from it.
Right.
Like it's that time preference thing is actually super interesting. At first I thought, this is cringe. What a load of bullshit. No, actually it's super true. If you have to really consider your purchases, if me and Danny are always talking whenever we're about to sell some Bitcoin, it's like, well, I might need to sell a bit of Bitcoin for this, should I? No, try not to. You know, whether it's a watch, a car, or a house, whatever. But we actually have I don't think I spent any Bitcoin without talking to you first.
I don't think I've ever sold Bitcoin.
I thought you sold some recently.
No.
Huh. I thought you did.
I stopped DCAing so I could buy a watch.
There you go.
But see,
So
here's the funny thing.
So you sold some future Bitcoin.
In economic terms, the opportunity cost, that's precisely the same as selling Bitcoin. True. So we convince ourselves. Can I tell you my story about selling Bitcoin?
Just very quickly.
Yeah.
But we had a conversation about that.
Yeah.
And there's a few times, but the point is every single time, I don't do it every time I spend money.
It's painful. But if you sell dollars or pounds, whatever, who cares?
Do it. But every time we have that conversation, it's like, is it worth it? Should I? And once you start doing that, you're really thinking about your future.
Yeah, it's true. It's a little bit like our conversation about dietary preference and being vegan or something earlier, where when I tried being vegan for a week or two was the first time I ever really paid attention to all the shit I'm putting in my body. Like I really began this process of reading, all the ingredients.
What is in this shit?
Citric acid.
Yeah. Well,
it's bad for your teeth, by the way.
Yeah, I'm British. My teeth are already bad. That's a really good point. I wish I looked at food and alcohol the way I looked at Bitcoin.
Yeah. What Bitcoin teaches you to do is to apply the same level of precision to your financials and your economics, right? Like almost as if you were a business, right? Because you're forced, I mean, you're an entrepreneur, you know this, you're forced as a business to do, what is it called? The 2-column accounting, and, you have to account for every dollar, every pound, every Satoshi, whatever. As individuals, we don't typically do this unless I guess maybe your parents were like accountants or something, right? Huh. But Bitcoin really makes me pay very close attention to my finances, my family's finances.
Yeah, it's done a lot. It's done a lot for me in terms of that. I've become very, I really consider my future, my kids' future. Right. I mean, I always had, like I told you about, putting that money away for my kids so they're traveling. Right. I've done things like that. But now there's very serious considerations about what I'm spending money on, why I'm spending money, what it's for, where I should be putting my money. I never thought about that before Bitcoin. It's always like, I'm earning enough money.
I have a good friend, really, really smart guy who was my colleague when I have a background in traditional finance. And he tried to convince me, this is, I don't know, 10 years ago, something like that. So I was in my 20s, earning a high salary, working on Wall Street. He said, look, you shouldn't be saving a single dollar. You should be spending every dollar you make. And there's a very rational argument for this, right? Because number one, you have high earning potential for the rest of your life. You're going to do fine. And number two, how do I put this? You can enjoy your dollars more today than you will 50 years from now, right? You can go out and spend that money on wining and dining and travel and all this stuff that you're not going to want to do, or you won't enjoy as much when you're older. And therefore, you should save nothing and spend everything today. It's kind of the exact opposite argument. I was almost convinced by this for a while.